The stagecoach rolled into Silver Creek, Montana Territory, in the autumn of 1879, carrying a woman in white silk gloves who had never in her life touched a plow, and by the time the dust of that arrival settled, a broken rancher would learn that the land could be saved not by calloused hands alone, but by a heart brave enough to bleed for a stranger's dream. If you believe in kindness, in faith, in redemption, and in the second chances that a merciful God sometimes hides inside our darkest hours, I ask you now, before this story carries you any further, to press like, leave a comment, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe so you never miss the stories that remind us who we truly are. Jedediah Coulter had buried his father, his younger brother, and finally his wife within the span of 4 brutal years on that stretch of Montana grassland he called Coulter Ridge. The ranch had once been 3,000 acres of good grass and better cattle, built by his father's hands out of nothing but stubbornness and prayer. But drought, a hard winter that froze half his herd standing in the fields, and a wife lost to fever had left Jed a 31-year-old man who looked 50, working land that seemed determined to bury him too. He rose before the sun and worked until the stars answered it, mending fences alone, branding alone, eating alone at a table built for a family of 6. The town of Silver Creek pitied him the way small towns pity a man they no longer know how to comfort, and Jed had stopped expecting comfort from anyone, including the God his mother had taught him to trust. It was Pastor Amos Whitfield, an old family friend down in St. Louis, who first put the notion in his head. Amos wrote to say he knew a respectable young woman of good Christian character who was seeking a fresh start out west, a woman named Charlotte Ainsworth, gently raised but willing, Amos swore, to work hard and build an honest life. Jed almost didn't answer the letter. He had no patience left for hope. Hope had cost him too much already. But the nights were long and the silence in that farmhouse had grown teeth, and so, more out of desperation than desire, he wrote back and asked for a wife who could work the land beside him, who understood cattle and calluses and the particular cruelty of a Montana winter, because he could not survive burying another person who wasn't fit for this life. Amos wrote back a single line of reassurance. Charlotte, he promised, would surprise him. She arrived on the 3 o'clock stage in a traveling dress of pale blue silk, a matching parasol, and gloves so white and so soft that Jed, waiting at the depot with his hat in his hands, felt something in his chest curdle into anger before she had even stepped down from the coach. Her hands, when she extended one to him in greeting, were smooth as a china plate, her nails trimmed and clean, her wrists thin as reeds. She smiled at him with a kind of nervous, hopeful brightness that he had no room left in his heart to answer, and he thought, with a bitterness that shamed him even as he felt it, that Amos Whitfield had sent him a porcelain doll to shatter on the first hard frost. He did not hide his disappointment on the ride back to Coulter Ridge. He spoke little, and what he did say was clipped and cold, informing her that this was a working ranch and not a parlor in St. Louis, that there would be no servants, no callers, no silk in the fields, and that he expected her to understand within the week that she had made a terrible mistake in coming. Charlotte said nothing to defend herself. She only watched the endless gold grass roll past the wagon, her gloved hands folded in her lap. And when they crested the last hill and Coulter Ridge came into view, the sagging barn, the fences leaning like tired old men, the house with its unpainted boards gray from years of weather, she did not flinch. She only said softly that it was beautiful country, and Jed, who had expected tears or complaints, found her calm harder to bear than either would have been. The first morning, she rose before he did. He found her in the kitchen at dawn attempting to light the cookstove with a box of matches, her silk gloves already discarded on the table, her hair coming loose from its pins, flour dusted across her borrowed apron. She had never cooked over a wood stove in her life and she burned the first batch of biscuits black, but she did not cry and she did not apologize with the helpless simpering he had braced himself for. She simply scraped the pan clean, asked him plainly how much wood the fire wanted, and tried again. By the second week she had blistered both palms trying to help him mend fence, and when he told her sharply to go back to the house where she belonged, she looked at him with an anger that surprised him, and said that she had not crossed half a continent to sit in a house and be useless, that Pastor Whitfield had told her what kind of man needed a wife who could work the land, and that she intended to become that woman whether Jedediah Coulter believed she could or not. There was a story behind those silk gloves, though it took Jed many weeks and one terrible night to learn it. Charlotte Ainsworth had not been raised in wealth, as her fine dress had suggested. The gloves and the dress had been the last remnants of a life that collapsed around her the year before, when her father, a St. Louis merchant, lost everything in a bad investment, and died of the shame and the debt within months, leaving Charlotte and her invalid mother destitute and dependent on relatives who made their charity feel like punishment. She had answered the call for a frontier bride not out of romance but out of desperation nearly as sharp as Jed's own, carrying her mother's medical expenses like a stone around her neck and wearing the last good dress she owned because it was the only dress she owned. She did not tell him this to win his pity. She told him one night in early winter, when a blizzard trapped them both in the house and the loneliness finally cracked something open in each of them, because she was tired, she said, of him believing she did not understand loss. Something shifted in Jed after that storm. He began to see the calluses forming beneath her once smooth skin, the sunburn on her neck where her collar didn't quite reach, the quiet, fierce determination with which she rose each morning to do work that had never once come naturally to her. She learned to milk the cow, though the animal kicked her twice hard enough to bruise. She learned to can vegetables from Widow Hattie McRae down the road, walking 3 miles each way because Jed could not spare a horse during branding season, and she came home each evening exhausted but never once complaining, and something in Jed's chest that had been frozen since his wife's death began, slowly and against his will, to thaw. But Coulter Ridge's troubles ran deeper than grief and hard weather. A land speculator named Silas Rourke had been buying up failing ranches throughout the valley for pennies on the dollar, and he had set his eye on Coulter Ridge's water rights, the creek that ran through Jed's north pasture and fed half the ranches downstream. Rourke had already ruined 2 of Jed's neighbors through manufactured debts and quiet threats, and when Jed refused to sell, cattle began disappearing from Coulter Ridge in the dead of night, fence lines were cut, and one morning Jed found his best bull lying dead in the north pasture with its throat opened, a message no honest rancher could misread. Sheriff Nathaniel Boone, an aging lawman with more patience than fight left in him, admitted plainly that he had no proof against Rourke, only suspicion, and that without proof his hands were tied. It was Charlotte, not Jed, who first suggested they were being watched, and it was Charlotte who noticed that the same 2 riders passed the ranch at the same hour 3 days running, studying the fence lines like men counting a fortress's weak points. She had grown up around her father's business dealings before the collapse, she reminded Jed, and she knew the particular smell of a man circling something he intended to take. When Jed dismissed her worry as a woman's nervousness, she did not back down the way he expected. She reminded him, with a steel in her voice he had not heard from her before, that she had watched her own father dismiss warnings until warnings became ruin, and she would not stand quietly by and watch it happen twice. The night Rourke's men came for the herd in earnest, it was Charlotte's instincts that saved what remained of Coulter Ridge. She had insisted, over Jed's objections, that they take turns keeping watch from the hayloft after the bull was killed, and it was her voice that cried out in the small hours of a moonless night when she spotted lantern light moving along the creek where no lantern belonged. Jed rode out half-dressed into the cold with his father's old rifle across his saddle, and what he found in the north pasture was 3 of Rourke's hired men attempting to drive off 24 head of cattle toward the county line. What happened next was not the stuff of dime novels. There was no clean, triumphant gunfight, only a desperate, terrified confrontation in the dark, shouted warnings, a shot fired wide to spook the rustler's horses, and Jed taking a graze along his ribs from a bullet that could easily have killed him before the 3 riders fled into the night, abandoning the cattle they'd gathered. Charlotte found him afterwards slumped against the corral fence, blood soaking through his shirt, and it was her hands, the same hands that had once worn silk gloves and never known a day's labor, that pressed the clean cloth to his wound and held it there with a strength that did not waver even as her own voice broke. That night, waiting for the doctor to arrive from town, sitting beside Jed's bed in the lamplight with his blood still dried beneath her fingernails, Charlotte finally said the thing she had been carrying silently for weeks, that she had not come to Montana hoping for love, only survival, but that somewhere between the burnt biscuits and the blizzard and the fence lines and this terrible night, survival had turned into something she had no name for, and she was afraid to speak it aloud because Jed had made it plain from the first day that his heart was buried with his first wife. Jed, weak from blood loss and stripped by pain of all his careful defenses, took her raw, work-worn hand in his and told her the truth he had been too proud and too frightened to say, that he had ordered a wife who could work the land, expecting nothing more than a partner for survival, and instead the Lord had sent him a woman whose courage put his own to shame, and that whatever silk gloves she had arrived in, it was these hands, scarred now and strong, that he never wanted to let go of again. Sheriff Boone finally got the proof he needed when one of Rourke's fleeing men, caught 2 counties over trying to sell branded Coulter Ridge cattle, testified against his employer to save his own neck from a rustling charge. Silas Rourke was arrested that winter, and Coulter Ridge's water rights, along with the rights of every ranch he had bled dry along that creek, were restored by a circuit judge who had grown tired of hearing Rourke's name attached to every ruined family in the valley. It was not a Hollywood ending delivered by gunfire and vengeance. It was the slower, harder justice of the frontier, built on testimony and patience and neighbors finally willing to speak the truth together instead of suffering alone. The town of Silver Creek, which had once pitted Jed Coulter as a man destined to lose everything, began instead to speak of Coulter Ridge as proof that a ranch, like a heart, could be rebuilt from ruin if enough faith and enough stubborn love were poured into the rebuilding. By the following spring, Charlotte's hands bore the honest marks of 2 full seasons of frontier labor, and she wore them, Jed often said, more beautifully than she had ever worn silk. She still kept the gloves, folded carefully in a cedar box at the bottom of their dresser, not out of vanity but as a reminder of the frightened, desperate young woman who had stepped off that stagecoach believing she had nothing left to offer the world but a fine dress and a false confidence. Jed married her properly that May, in a small ceremony on the ranch with Pastor Whitfield's letter of blessing read aloud by Sheriff Boone himself, and the valley that had once watched Coulter Ridge with pity now watched it with something closer to wonder, as the herd grew strong again, as new fences rose straight and sure, as laughter, long absent from that farmhouse, returned to fill rooms that had known only silence and grief. Before I carry this story to its close, I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll take a moment to answer honestly in the comments below. Tell me where in the world you are watching this story from tonight, and tell me what lesson you are carrying away with you, whether it is that we should never judge a person's strength by the softness of their hands, or that love built through hardship endures longer than love built on ease, or simply that it is never too late for a broken heart to be made whole again. I read every single comment, and I would be honored to know your heart met this story the way I hope it did. Charlotte Coulter lived the rest of her long life on that Montana ridge, and neighbors who visited in her later years often noticed the small cedar box she kept on her windowsill, and the pair of yellowed silk gloves inside it, worn now only on the anniversary of her wedding, when she would slip them on for a single hour and remember the frightened, hopeful young woman who had once believed she had nothing to give a hard land and a harder man, and who had discovered instead that the truest wealth of the frontier was never in the cattle or the water rights or the acres of grass, but in 2 people choosing, every single difficult morning, to build something lasting out of nothing but faith, grit, and each other. If this story of kindness, courage, and second chances touched your heart tonight the way it touched mine in the telling, I ask you one final time to press like, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to remember that redemption is always possible, and subscribe so that more stories of faith and hope from the Old West can find their way to you. Until the next story carries us west again, may you hold fast to the belief that no heart, however broken, and no land, however hard, is ever truly beyond saving.